I have a streak. It's not what I wanted, but I have a streak. That's that. The problem isn't that. The problem is something else. And I can't do anything about that. It is for me. It is for me.
Somebody's got to.
I can't do anything. Because it's a weapon. Because this is shooting weapon. Everything always fucking goes wrong. It's embarrassing. It's the same thing.
What's that?
This is the same thing that happened. It's the exact same thing. And that was embarrassing enough. Now it's happening.
Well, I mean, you don't have to.
I just, it's not, it's in YouTube. Nobody else
Okay. Okay, very good. You guys need anything? I don't need my mic up. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. There are a couple seats up front here if anyone wants a seat. Ironically, there was no coercion involved in getting the audience to come. This is quite an audience. My name is Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. My pleasure to welcome you to today's event. I have on one of our older vets. The center grew out of something that we still have called the Tocqueville program. Tocqueville program is what brought me here to Notre Dame. And at the heart of the Tocqueville program was and is questions on religion and public life. And so I thought I'd put my old vest on because today's event is exactly what the Tocqueville program was meant to do and what we still do through the center. Let me start with a few thank yous and then introduce our student. We'll introduce our speaker. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture, Notre Dame Law School, and for the program on Church, State, and Society. And thank you especially to Professor Garnett, who directs the program of Church, State, and Society, who's with us, and to our friend Carter Sneed, the director of the Nicholas Center. My staff is just incredible, the staff at the center, so I want to recognize them. Jen Smith, Soren Greffenstadt, Anthony Malley, and Mary Frances Myler. It's a big week for us. We have today's event. On Wednesday, we're actually facilitating an event at the law school. Robert Alt, the president of the Buckeye Institute, will be giving a talk at 12:30 on Wednesday on COVID, emergency power, and religious liberty. Another event right at the heart of the Tocqueville program. So that's on Wednesday at 12:30 at the law school, COVID, emergency power, and religious liberty. And then on Friday, we have one of our biggest events of the year. The center will be hosting Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, just coincidentally the weekend of our Clemson football game. We'll be having a fireside chat with him on covering his new book and his politics. The title of his book is called Redemption, an American Story. I just finished reading it myself. It's a really a great read and an interesting book. So come join us on Wednesday at the law school at 12:30. Friday's event is at 11 a.m. It's a little bit early. And it's in the Carey Auditorium. That's the auditorium connected to the library. If you want a seat, I'd advise you to get there early. I think that will be quite crowded. So Friday at 11 a.m. Senator Scott will be signing books beforehand, starting I think at 10:30. Okay, as you know, we have a tradition here at the center. We have our student fellows introduce our speakers, and so I'm going to call to the podium here Corinne Carlson. Corinne is a senior. I think she was been a four-year fellow, since her first year, a Con Studies minor, and she will introduce Professor Pink. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our visiting speaker today. Professor Thomas Pink has taught for most of his career at King's College London. He writes on the freedom of the will, on ethics and political philosophy, and on the history of these subjects. He read history and philosophy at Cambridge University, where he also received his PhD. After working in London and New York for a merchant bank, he returned to philosophy in 1990 as a research fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge. He then lectured at Sheffield University prior to moving to King's College in 1996. His current project is on the political theory of Thomas Hobbes and his relation to natural philosophy and theology. His lecture today is titled The Church, the State, and the Authority to Coerce. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pink.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for all the institutions at Notre Dame that's been so kind to invite me. Last year, when Traditionis Custodes came out, they developed what is often very unedifying, a Twitter spat in social media amongst irate and emotional people. And unlike a lot of Twitter spats, this one was not without interest. Supporters of Traditionis Custodes pointed out that you really got to obey this one. And they gave reference to Pastor Aeternus, who's on my handout. Therefore, in relation to this, just towards the bottom half of the first page, Therefore, in relation to this juridical authority of the Pope, clergy and faithful of whatever right and dignity, both singly and collectively, are bound by a duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience, not only in matters concerning faith and morals, but also in those which regard the discipline and government of the Church throughout the world. And if you thought you were going to criticise this document, don't, because that will be Protestant. The sentence of the Apostolic See, than which there is no higher authority, is not subject to revision by anyone, nor may anyone lawfully pass judgment thereupon. One keyboard ultramontane actually shoved up a copy of past judgments with this passage underlined in green ink, which is helpful. But immediately as this happened, there was a riposte. And the riposte is quite interesting because the riposte is refers also to texts from the papalist tradition in Catholic theology. Pastor Right Ernest finds a papal primacy in teaching and legislation. It's a papalist magisterial document, but there's an awful lot of papalist theological documents from the Counter-Reformation by people like Bellarmine and Suarez, who had a similar conception of primacy to those of many 19th century ultramontanes. And these seem to be saying, actually, you can disobey the Pope. So we have Bellarmine. As it is lawful to resist the Pope if he attacks the body, so it is lawful to resist him if he attacks the soul or afflicts the state, and much more if he seeks to destroy the Church. It is permitted, I say, to resist him by not doing what he commands and by preventing the execution of his will. But it is not lawful to judge him, or to punish him, or to praise him, which alone is the base business of the superior. Okay. And then even more pertinent to the traditionalist soul was this passage from Suarez. This is about how a pope could fall into schism from the Church. It's from De Caritate. And a pope could be schismatic in this second way. So this isn't departing from unity with the Pope, it's the Pope departing from unity with the Church. If he wished not to maintain unity and communion with the whole body of the Church as it should, such as if he wanted to abolish all ecclesiastical ceremonies that are based on apostolic tradition. You can see that was grist a certain tradition as well. So this is actually in itself quite interesting. How does the papalist tradition of Catholic theology have what appears to be diametrically opposed conceptions of whether or not you should obey papal authority in matters of legislation? I'm going to say that I don't think either party to this spat is going to win the debate on their terms. They're both, importantly, getting the texts wrong in various ways. But it gives rise to a very, very important issue, namely, if the Church and the Pope within the Church can teach infallibly, might it not also be true that they can legislate infallibly as well? By legislate infallibly, I mean legislate in a way that's guaranteed not to involve any clash with morals or with real truth, and possibly also not do undue damage to the Church. So it's always better to obey. Or is the infallibility only attaching to teaching and not to legislation? To understand this issue, we've got to see that for much of the last few years in the Church, I won't say more widely than that, I just don't have the knowledge to make the claims. There has been a widely supported, what I'm going to call, I'm going to explain this term, official theology of canonical legislation, of church law and church discipline by the Pope or by the bishops, which supposes it to be infallible. We'll see that this official theology of an infallibility of legislation, attaching to the Pope in particular, if you're a papalist, has a lot of support. And I'm now going to say where the support comes from and discuss whether this official theology is credible or not, and what problems it might cause, and where it came from. And this is going to involve not just the Church, so wider set of problems to do with the state, because central to understanding this whole topic is the fact that in the Catholic tradition, there isn't just one kind of sovereign legislative authority with further authority not just to issue legislative directives, but to enforce these directives with threats of punishment. We all understand the state is a kind of sovereign authority. The state can make laws and then enforce these laws by threat of punishment, and it's sovereign. But for Catholics, as the quotation from Leo the 13th, very beginning of the handout reminds us, Immortale Dei, not long after Pastor Eternus, there are in fact two potestates on this earth. They use the word potestas for a sovereign legal authority to enforce directives and then enforce those directives with threats of punishment. Because I'm not being neutral about whether we're talking about the church or the state, because it could be either. And Leo the 13th is saying there are two potestates, two sovereign authorities. There's the state, which governs the civil order, and then there is the church, which governs religion on this earth. The church too has the right to make laws which apply to those within her jurisdiction, which is baptized, and enforce those laws with threats of punishment. Now, Immortale Dei is an incredibly important document. I've argued elsewhere that it's actually used by the drafting commission of Dignitatis Humanae Vatican II to explain the meaning and content of the declaration. And can look at Dignitatis Humanae as one of the major exercises of Leonine political theology. But I'm not going to push that one here, but I want to look at this parallel between ecclesial and political authority. Because how does legal authority work if the church can be a potestas as well as the state? It's not obvious that that's going to be possible. A lot of people have a view of what sovereign coercive authority can be like, but will pretty immediately exclude the church, as we really understand. If we look at the handout, the first model of coercive authority is the idea of potestas, legal authority, as a coordinator. And this is a model of political authority that's very, very common in modern political philosophy. Basically, we all share a lot of desires. We want to desire security, we want a decent transport system. We don't want gridlock in the city. We need some sort of authority to sort, and we want security. We need some sort of authority to sort this out. And so we, through convention, erect a legal authority that enables us better to satisfy these widely shared desires, provided we all do, within certain limits, what this authority dictates. And so it addresses what we can do or avoid doing on the basis of response. The point of what Hobbes called the voluntary, like parking your car one place, not another, tax to circulate, driving the left rather than the right. And we obey it in that way, our desire for transport, security. Basically, the coordinative model takes our passions, appetites, the widely shared character that they actually possess, and leaves us better to satisfy them. That cannot be what the church is about, as we all know the church. You'd have to have a pretty crude view of a prosperity gospel to see the church is about doing something like that. What the church is about is, through her teaching and her sacramental system and the laws governing all that, changing our motivations, changing our beliefs, transforming us to a new creation, so to speak, raised to a supernatural level. That's not going to be done by a coordinative authority. What it's going to have to involve is the other model of a potestas, of legal authority as a teacher. In this model, what all this legal direction is about, of course, they're interested in coordination. They want the transport system to work. They want people to wear the same liturgical colours on the same day. But much more profoundly, what this authority is about is teaching us and changing our attitudes through the law, through legal direction. This legal direction is transformative. It's going to change what we want to do, so we become, full of caritas instead of other nastier motivations, and it's going to change what we believe. We will exercise the virtue of faith. It will regulate our beliefs. If you look at the canon law of the church, parallel to the civil law of the state, it has law regulating belief, magisterial authority which imposes canonical obligations of what you believe. And there's the crime of heresy, which is theoretically punished, which deals with violations of these you're always very baptized. Okay, so we've got this model of Protestant teaching. I think that actually this model is the best understanding that states are not just coordinated mechanisms. They are in the teaching sense. When states pass laws making things like theft illegal, those laws and the punishments that enforce them about teaching everyone that property rights are really important. That's what the judge will say in the courtroom when he sends you down for 10 years, whatever it was he pleaded. I'm going to make this point very clear that the crime was morally very serious. So this legal structure. But I'm not going to argue that further. What matters to us is if we look at the problem of the moral force of ecclesial legislation, of canon law, it's always discussed within the periods I'm going to be discussing, within the context of this teaching model of coercive authority. And that, of course, is going to start leading us into the idea that if the church is an infallible teacher, then she might also be an infallible legislator. It might work something like this. The church, unlike the state, I mean, the state I'm saying is a teacher, so is the church. But the state can be a fallible teacher. It can teach horrible things about family structure. Maybe some states are doing that at the moment. I won't argue that one. But the church is supposed to be an infallible teacher. And if she teaches through her legislation, mustn't that mean that the legislation is going to be infallible too? We're going to come back to this line of thought again and again in various passages. So that's the important understanding of what a potestas is, the role, the idea of a particular model of legal authority as educative is playing this way. The other phrase I've used, and I said I would explain to you, is the idea of official theology. The church teaches, officials from the church are conveying what they want to be information to you, and what is true. Not all of it, though. Some of it is magisterial teaching. When that information is conveyed, it's conveyed by an office holder in the church who possesses magisterial authority, which is the authority to impose canonical obligations on them. You've actually got to believe it if it's de fide or it's infallible. If it's fallible, then we have this interesting notion of submission of mind and will. It's a kind of obligation on the mind. But a lot can be said about this. And I just need to leave Danny is understood, but they are part of what defines magisterial teaching in the Genesis and the Code of Canon Law, 1982 Code. But an awful lot of information conveyed by office holders as part of what's expected for them to say does not come with any suggestion of the position of canonical obligation. It could be someone who actually is possessive of magisterial authority in the church, but they're just giving you their view. It's the Pope on an aeroplane, a dread event, or it's a statement from the International Theological Commission, which everyone knows aren't magisterial. Or it could be from someone who actually is an office holder. They're the parish priest, but they aren't in a position to impose canonical obligation like the Pope is. They are, of course, conveying, one hopes, magisterial teaching. But what they themselves say doesn't add to the obligation. All the obligation comes from the magisterial teaching itself. And as soon as they go beyond the magisterial teaching or start contradicting it, then any obligation on you, which entirely comes from magisterial teaching, gets away, it seems to me. And the church is full of official theology, and always it's the interface that gives us, most of us, any given time, our understanding of what magisterial teaching is. And most Catholics will get it from their parish priest, a pamphlet, a catechism. I mean, the latest catechism is supposed to add to the obligations in relation to the magisterial teaching it refers to. All this interface is the medium through which most of us understand magisterial teaching. The thing about official theology, of which this official theology of the infallibility of church legislation is one case, is that it's constantly changing. It varies from place to place. At certain times in in your history. Go to Rome, and the official theology you will hear of papal authority. Go to Paris, and you'll hear a very different story. Or change temporal location. Go to Europe at the end of the 15th century, Cardinal Cajetan, and he will give you a rather optimistic view about the destiny of unbaptized children who die before the age of reason. They may be saved from our mother's prayer. He's nearly condemned Christians without a trail. And then you get a really rigid sort of Augustinianism. Someone like Dennis thinks that, who's a Jesuit, an anti-Jansenist, thinks that unbaptized children who died actually something how. And then by the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, we moved to a benign environment whereby everyone seems to go and directly to heaven by stages. But there's no change in magisterial teaching. This is just immense changes in official theology. So, official theology can change. It's not consistent over time and place. It can sometimes be very silent for some parts of teaching. It can even contradict it. I could tell you some stories about the official theology of the church in Flanders, but it's private. Okay. So we've got official theology of canonical legislation. I've just given you some quotes from Bellarmine and Suarez, which treat, or appear to treat, papal legislation as canonical. We've had Bellarmine saying, look, if the Pope could attack the church, he must resist it. And Suarez saying, look, if the Pope waiting for some radical, as he specified in third reform, you could resist him. Clearly, what's going on here is an acknowledgement of at least of a notion of canonical legislation going wrong. And surely they're right to make that. Read, for example, Bellarmine's treatment de Romano Pontifice on the Roman Pontiff, the controversies. He's very, very clear that humanly made law, which human law is as much as civil law, can go wrong. It's got a job. It's meant to be applying some other law, like the canon law. It's the case of the revealed law of the New Covenant. In the case of civil law, it's natural law, but you can get that wrong. And in particular cases, they don't want to rule out the notional possibility that the Pope could, for example, give a particular directive that conflicted with a revealed or naturally known morality, or was in some other way very damaging to the church. And Bellarmine is very clear about that. And that means that they must surely be, and I think they're surely right about it, so that when we go back to Pastor Aeternus, we should bear in mind their point that a legal obligation is not a moral obligation. And what Pastor Aeternus is clearly doing is defining juridical structure with a legal primacy. There's no legal appeal against the papal. You can't appeal to any higher authority in the church. That doesn't mean it's going to carry moral force. It's just there's going to be no court of appeal that will hear your case within the church. To come back to that slightly unpleasant thought and what we do about it. Okay, so that should be right. If we look at Newman, if we go to page 2, shortly after the Vatican Council, Newman writes a very famous letter addressed to the Duke of Norfolk, and he makes the point that Pastor Aeternus defines both the papal primacy of teaching and the papal primacy of legislation is not defining papal infallibility. He says, in doing this, I shall with him put aside for the present and at first the Pope's prerogative of infallibility in general enunciations, whether of faith or morals, and confine myself to the consideration of his authority in matters of conduct and our duty of obedience to him. But a Pope is not infallible in his laws, nor in his commands, nor in his acts of state, nor in his administration, or in his public policy. So Newman is making he's an infallible teacher, but he's not an infallible legislator. Pastor Aeternus just otherwise. But not everyone takes Newman's view of Vatican I. H.E. Manning, Cardinal Manning, famous relationship with, writes a letter as Archbishop of Westminster explaining the Vatican Council's definitions. And he clearly seems to think that actually there is a capable of infallibility in legislation. In a word, the whole magisterium or doctrinal authority of the Pontiff, supreme doctrine of Christians, is included in this definition of infallibility, and also all legislative or judicial acts, so far as they're separately connected with this doctrinal authority, as for instance all judgments, sentences, decisions, etc., under this will come laws of discipline. Teaching and infallibility of legislation. And slightly later, around the turn of the end of the 20th century, we have another very important, rather more important theologian than Manning, Bio, a chap who fell out with Pius XI in the 20th century over axiom falsity. But he's a very eminent theologian, and he says, infallibility always attaches to the exercise of the supreme authority in the church, insofar as the church has divine assistance and can never establish discipline of those rules of faith within evangelical holiness. So we've got, apart from Newton, people, for reasons slightly mysterious, taking it as read that the Pope is an infallible legislator. Now, what's going on? Well, the first point to make is that whatever might have appeared on the Traddy blog, unfortunately, depending on your opinion of this matter, Bellarmine and Suarez are a bit close. Manning and Biko than you might have thought from these quotes torn on the internet from their original context. When Suarez and Bellarmine are conceiving the possibility of legislative error at the ecclesial level, they are doing it as part of a rather sophisticated way of attacking conciliarist theology. So what they're saying is, look, no matter what, conciliarist. Look, guys, we can understand and see the possibility that the Pope might make unjust laws, effective laws. So there needs to be some constitutional remedy within the church to keep this guy under control. That means there must be some forum of legal appeal. That means you appeal to the General Council and put that right. And what Suarez and Bellarmine are doing is something a bit like this, conceding an in principle possibility of error for a particular directive, a sort of limit possibility, and then introducing hypothetical cases that are really, if per impossibile hypotheses. Look, you guys, you think the Pope could get it really badly wrong. We won't actually argue with you. Let's take something really drastic. We will show you what happens if that happens. And we're going to have a solution that's not conciliarist. You're not going to say, if the Pope did that drastic, unpleasant thing, well, we'd have to appeal to General Council. That will put it right. We're going to say, look, if the Pope does that amazing, unpleasant thing, then the thing to do, then the thing to do is just not to obey him. That's what sort of non-constitutional remedy of just you neuter the erring Pope by mass back in the box. But they don't really intend to prepare a chart for popular resistance to papal authority. In fact, that's very, very far in their minds. If we look at the cases, particularly Suarez uses, we can see these are preparing possibile hypotheses. So Suarez sort of says, look, if the Pope wanted to abolish all ecclesiastical ceremonies, then he'd be a kind of schismatic. Now, what does he mean by abolish all ecclesiastical ceremonies? He needs to put himself total schism from everyone else in the church. This is a bit more drastic than the Pauline liturgical reform. Even if you don't like the Pauline liturgical reform, it wasn't that. So what does Suarez have in mind? He doesn't say it, but he refers to Juan de Torquemada, a pre-credit papalist, who actually runs the same line of argument. Torquemada does do this. They're really drastic. This is a pope who abolishes the sign of the cross, all liturgical vestments, abolishes all forms of liturgy that are identifiably Christian. So what they're doing is he's making a point about the papacy as being central to the unity of the church by saying, if the papacy went this wrong, then of course you'd be destroying, you'd be utterly misfunctioning as a principle of unity in the church. So it will be in a way systematic. But it doesn't mean that this is a real possibility. And he parallels it with another case. Exactly the same passage in the Coerce. He says, supposing the Pope, this is the other way a Pope could be a citizen of the church, excommunicated everyone else in the church. And they did. So this is a impossible thought experiment designed to illustrate actually how important paper is for the unity of the church. This isn't a ticket for resisting Paul's faith when good or evil. And actually, when you look at what they really think of they think it is indeed infallible. One very, very general feature actually of theology as I know it is that it is generally thought that canonical legislation, once it's settled and universal, cannot be annulled. It's just taken for granted. Here's a passage from Suarez, from De Fide. He's asking whether the church is justified in using sanctions to punish people for heresy. And he says, of course the church is justified, because it's a feature, undisputed feature of canon law. Secondly, I prove the claim from the custom of the church. The whole church makes use of an authority to do this, an authority that has been so employed since ancient times. But the whole church cannot err in moral questions and in matters pertaining to religion and justice. It is in itself quite unbelievable that the church usurps this authority tyrannically without legitimate title. So he's not referring to some magisterial teaching, the sort we would understand. He's referring to the canonical law of the church, its character, and its character. If you look at Trent, when they're debating what anathematizing canons to impose against Protestants and other heretics, in many cases, what they will do is appeal not to some previous magisterial teaching, as we would understand doctrinal teaching. They will appeal to canonical procedures. The Protestant proposal is violated. I've done a lot of work on the condemnation of Erasmus, who thought that the church shouldn't coerce people into fidelity if they were baptized but wanted to leave the church. And they argue for the condemnation of Erasmus, largely to Toledo IV, which provides such coercion. The Visigothic council from the early 20s. And there's no debate about this because it's part of the Gratian decree, of the standard people authorities rely upon in the church. So, again, Bellarmine says, you'll become the real Bellarmine, what he really thinks. The Supreme Pontiff not only cannot err in doctrines of the faith, but nor can he err in moral directives given for the whole church, which are concerned with matters necessary to salvation or what is per se good or bad. So the Pontiff cannot direct what is vicious, such as usury, or direct what is now contrary to salvation, the practice of circumcision, or forbid what is necessary to salvation, the practice of baptism. But, he concedes, it is not absurd to say he could direct what is neither good nor bad in itself, nor in itself contrary to salvation, but simply useless. But clearly, even if he does that, even if it's defective in some other way, it's not going to be that bad. But it is not for subjects to debate this issue, but only to obey. The real Bellarmine is that. This is infallible, or if not infallible, so in some sense yet to come to guarantee that the only thing to do is to stifle your objections and do what you're told. Okay. This insouciance on the part of Bellarmine might be a little optimistic. I need to say some doubts about it later on. But I just want to look now at why we might believe this theory of the infallibility of the church as a legislator. And clearly, as I've already said, one way of coming to it would be as part of an argument for the infallibility of the church as a teacher, through this model of legislative authority as educative. And we find this in a very interesting passage, but you can find it all around the Counter-Reformation theology. This is Melchior Carno, a very, very influential theologian. De Locis Theologicis, which comes around 1563, and is very influential into the 19th century. You should look at the section of the Theology Catholica on Carno, it's very large. He says, then the church cannot define something to be a vice, what is good, to be virtuous, what is morally bad. Therefore, in the law which she makes, the church cannot approve something that is contrary to the gospel or to reason. For which reason, just as a council cannot put forward what they ought to believe, so it cannot put forward evil as to be done. Why might that be true? Well, look, supposing I tell you, do X, and we use this educative conception of law. In telling you to do X, plausibly, I'm communicating the thought to you that doing X is at least not bad. It's at least okay. Otherwise, me as with all this moral authority, why am I telling you to do X? And of course, if I'm an infallible teacher, I can't then tell you to do X, and X is actually morally wrong, because then I'd be failing to teach infallibly. That, I think, is a pattern of thought going on for these people. But the distinction between magisterial teaching and official theology tells us how this one goes wrong. Remember, church teaching is only preserved from error if it's actually magisterial teaching, if it's imposing some sort of canonical obligation on the mind. Now, by, as keys of authority, telling you to do X, I might be conveying the thought to you that doing X is implied, but I'm not ipso facto conveying imposing a canonical obligation on you to believe that doing X is all right. Canonical obligation I'm imposing on you is simply to do X. I'm just leaving you with the impression, without any further exercise of canonical authority, that doing X is right. So I could be completely wrong about doing X being right. I haven't met the standards for magisterial teaching. I'm just going in for some official theology and conveying thought in my official exercise, my official function, but without formally imposing a canonical obligation. That seems to happen generally when the Pope, when the Church or Pope just gives you canonical directives to do something. So I might be misleading you, but I'm not failing to teach in the way that I should, because we just got an exercise of official theology this time, I would argue. Okay. Well, there's another line of argument that these counter-reformation theologians rely on, beyond some sort of, I think, invalid inference from the infallibility of the Church's magisterium to the alleged infallibility of the legislative exercise of the legislative authority. And this is a different appeal. This is the appeal to an actual case of magisterial teaching to the effect the Church is an infallible legislator. And we find this, again, in Kano. And this is the theory of divine assistance for canonical legislation. This is a specific teaching supposed to actually guarantee to you, as a matter of faith, that God or the Holy Spirit assists the Church in a canonical legislation. So, of course, if directly assisted by the Holy Spirit, we get this in De Locis Theologicis. But the canons of the Church are issued on the prompting of the Holy Spirit, as Damasus says. Actually, it's stronger in the original text. I checked this morning. It's as Damasus defines, determines. Who is Damasus? He's Damasus the First. And this is from a passage in the doctrinal part of the Corpus of Canon Law, Gratian's Decretum. And this follows. Gratian's Decretum, the oldest part of the Corpus of Canon Law, read, Pope Damasus is writing a letter at the end of the 4th century to another very famous prelate, Aurelius, Bishop of Carthage. And he's saying, those who voluntarily breach the canons are harshly judged by the Holy Fathers and condemned by the Holy Spirit at whose prompting they are issued. Since someone who shamelessly does or speaks something against the same canons, when not compelled by necessity to do so, but acting freely, or who freely consents to others willingly so doing, is rightly seen to be blaspheming against the Holy Spirit. Such presumption is clearly of one kind with blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, since, as we have already said, they are acting against him at whose prompting by whose grace the holy canons are issued. Wow, this is really convincing. Now we know we need to obey the canonical legislation of the Church, if the Holy Spirit has prompted it directly. Okay, the problem with this one, though it's not popular period, is Pope Damasus is a forgery. This is from the false decretals of Pseudo Isidore, a collection of faked ecclesiastical decrees from the early popes that seems to have originated in 9th century France. Possibly, scholars debated, to support the case of somebody, Ebbo, Archbishop of Rheims, who'd been deposed by a Carolingian ruler. And this whole collection of fake decretals starts off with a fake letter from Aurelius saying, "Oh, esteemed Pope Damasus, please send me some debt so I know how to run my church." And then Damasus says, "Here you are, mate." And they were all full of stuff that supports the position of someone like Edo against the people who've done him wrong. Canons of reams that are currently suspected of having done this. And of course, it begins with a resounding affirmation of the moral force of the forged canons and all other canonical material. This, people are having doubts about this stuff. I'm graciously convinced by it, perhaps the Decretum. But by the 16th century, humanist scholars are getting very doubtful about this lot. There is a lot of resistance from Catholic third agencies. You can't find it very convenient to assume that Pope Damasus didn't write this letter. It's only in the early 17th century that scales fall from everyone's eyes, thanks to a French scholar, and this goes away. That's not the end of appeals to magisterial or alleged magisterial authority to support the infallibility of legislation, legislation, papal legislation in particular. Bio, when he's writing around 1900, refers to another, this time genuine magisterial text. This is from Pius VI, Auctorium Fide. Sean Blanchard, as some of you probably know, has done a lot of interesting work showing how important Auctorium Fide was to 19th century theology. Auctorium Fide is a decree of Pius VI coming around in 1794, condemning a sort of Jansenist sort of assembly organised by the Grand Duke Leopold of Tuscany, Synod of Pistoia. And it's a list of condemned propositions, condemned with varying degrees of force, tackling the proceedings and decrees of the Synod of Pistoia. There's one particular proposition, 78, that is pertinent to us. The Jansenist, largely a Jansenist proposition, runs like this. It's making a distinction between teaching and discipline. Exactly what was in question. That which pertains to faith and to the essence of religion must be distinguished from that which is proper to discipline. In this discipline itself, there is to be distinguished what is necessary or useful to attain the faith of the Spirit from that which is useless or too burdensome for the liberty of the sons of the new covenant to endure, but more so from that which is dangerous or harmful, leading to superstition and materialism. And Pius VI does not like this one, this distinction between faith and discipline on these terms. He says, insofar as by the generality of the words its proposition includes and submits to a prescribed examination, even the discipline established and approved by the Church, as if the Church, which is ruled by the Spirit of God, could have established discipline which is not only useless and burdensome for Christian liberty to endure, but which is even dangerous and harmful, since leading to superstition and materialism, false, rash, scandalous, dangerous, offensive to pious ears, injurious to the Church and to the Spirit of God, by whom she is guided, at least erroneous. Bio says, right, that shows the Church as an infallible. Let's actually run that argument. I put it to you, it's not clear actually what this proposition is actually, what this condemnation is actually applying to. Is it meant to teach as a revealed doctrine that the Church has been given a guarantee of the existence of the Holy Spirit in her legislation? And that the Jansenist Synod people have falsely denied this revealed doctrine? Or is it saying something rather different, which is that since, certainly in Pius VI's opinion, the Church has in fact been assisted by the Holy Spirit in her legislation, given that fact, it's really very impious, rude to the Holy Spirit for these guys to start criticising all these canons that the Holy Spirit has assisted the Church in making. In the first case, you would have heresy over some revealed doctrine about the relation of the Holy Spirit, guarantee of his assistance to the Church, because of being issued revealed doctrine. In the second case, you've got a really rather rude reaction to canons that the Holy Spirit has in fact helped issue. That's not heresy, but it's certainly impious. And it won't, the second reading, which I think is much more plausible, won't get you the infallibility of penal legislation, which requires on guarantee, which is not being, I think, explicitly taught. So I think Newman, for example, was quite right to swear by as Bio was. If we look in the 20th century, we get, after the Second Vatican Council, a curious sort of reminiscence of all this stuff. Both the argument from the church's teacher and her infallibility as teacher to her infallibility as legislator, and also gestures to the idea of assistance in the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith's document Donum Veritatis on the ecclesiarification of the theologian, which it addresses the moral authority of ecclesial legislation. It's quite interesting, slightly fudgy little passage. All acts of magisterium derive from the Scriptures, that is, from Christ, who desires that his people walk in the entire truth, so with reference to the church's teacher. For this same reason, magisterial decisions are matters of discipline, even if they are not guaranteed by the charism of infallibility. So Bio and Manning, tough, we're not going to push your line anymore, are not without divine assistance and call for the adherents of the faithful. So you can see, there's a sort of gesture towards the assistance. There's a gesture to an inference from the truth of the teaching, but they're not going to quite go there anymore. But they still say, but you still got to obey, really. Call for, But look, guys, if there's no guarantee that legislation can't go badly wrong, why is there guarantee any? Why should we assume that we always have to obey? We need a little more of a story here. If it can go wrong, maybe it can go very wrong. If it goes very wrong, then maybe it could have the truth we didn't obey. So how are we going to sort this? Well, one way of resolving this is to let's look at what legislation the church has actually that meets something like Cardinal Bellarmine's or Pio's conditions for infallibility, or not actually infallible. It's still obviously better to obey rather than God will see you right. It won't be that bad. Let's look back at the history of the church for some. I'm going to provide you with some, I think, really dodgy, that horrible legislation. I mean, the long-standing, for a very long time, canonical legislation of the church governing Christian behaviour towards the Jews, which can be found in Gratian's Decretum. There it is again in part of the decrees of Toledo, which Carnot reminds us of the Council of Reformation. It's a really, really authoritative council. All bishops must fully informed of and apply the decrees of Toledo. And you also find them in the decretals of Gregory the Ninth. You will find further material coming in the modern period from popes like Carafa and Gregory the XIII. What does this legislation do? It obviously doesn't bind the Jews themselves. They're not baptized, but we are. And what they're telling Christians to do is to keep the Jews. So the Jews must not be allowed to go to synagogues, certainly not be in Christian places where Christians live. Christians must avoid social contact. They must work from the servants. They can't have meals with them. If a Jew is baptized, they must be restricted from contact with those still practicing Judaism. Their parents' relation included. They must wear identifying dress. Christians should have no illusion that they're dealing with someone who's practicing a yellow hat or a yellow cape or something like that. They must be restricted on holy days. No Jews were wandering around on Good Friday to Christian atmosphere. So what is all this legislation? It's not, in fact, not about forcing Jewish conversion. That's really off. You can't coerce the faith of the unbaptized. What it's about is keeping Jews at a distance so that they don't infect with their unbelief, superstition. And what this policy is doing is prioritizing keeping Christians free of false belief over what I would have thought is the true mission of the church, because I'm old fashioned enough to think the church has a mission to convert the Jews as well as the Gentiles. Prioritizing keeping the Jews at arm's length over any form of interaction with fellowship with them would actually make Christianity at all attractive. Because what all these regulations breed is fear and contempt. And when you actually did get around, we do have a mission, what you do, you use force to keep them at a distance. You use force then, not to convert them, but to force them to hear the gospel. And so once you get to the limit of this sort of keep force ghettoization of the views in Rome, you then have Gregory XIII's compulsory conversionary sermons. They're not being forced to convert, but they are being forced to hear the gospel. So if you read Sancta Mater Ecclesia, which is Gregory XIII's bull of 1584, which addresses the entire church, so this is law for the entire church, it imposes on all prelates the duty, wherever there is a synagogue large enough for a Jewish congregation, to force Jews, with the help of the secular power, to attend a conversionary sermon on the afternoon Jewish Sabbath. It calls on all Christian rulers to aid in this, and it imposes excommunication on any baptized Christian. You see what's happened. You force the Jews out, then to missionize them, you just have to force them in again. It's gruesome. I mean, the conversionary sermons go on, they stop the French Revolution, they're started by the 12th, they only end with Pius IX. Now, what this is, I think, law is immensely damaging to the church, because it deeply compromised the idea that the church has a mission to Jew and Gentile alike. You can't talk about mission to Jews in the church, because it's just, you look as though you want some rad trad or something like that. Read the New Testament, it's central. But the reason why this happens, they've got loads of guilt about this atrocious canon law, which went on for centuries. What's going on, I think, is this. Canon law can clearly go very wrong. It can go wrong in ways that are damaging to the church, and I think also directly violate humanity. I think these laws violated the duty of charity to the Jewish people in a very, very fundamental way. They meet all the criteria for Bellarmine's. They're certainly, even if they didn't do that, they're certainly immensely damaging the way that useless, rather understates. So they can happen. But then this brings us back to my original problem. One of the original features of this discussion of the papalist theologians of Counter-Reformation. What happens when canonical legislation goes very seriously? Well, one thing pastoral attendance shows, there's no legal appeal against it. You can't go to some bishop or set of bishops and say, put this guy right, this is dreadful. No one has the competence legally to do that. So what do? Well, of course, by this stage, we might well think that the obligation, moral obligation to obey in every case is much less forceful than Suarez and Bellarmine clearly thought. In fact, in these cases, maybe we should be under a moral obligation to disobey. We'll invite Jewish people around to our house. If, for example, it is indeed true that it is an unjust decree, and I'm not going to make any comment about it, then why not break it? That's quite a lot of people probably don't. But the problem with disobedience one is that you're not going to get no provision. And unless you get the cooperation of the bishops, you're going, especially the priests, to end up in a hard place rather fast. And the fact that you might have moral justification for this is a guarantee of assistance. We all know enough about politics and bishops to know that. So what do you do? Well, I think in the end, is that the mistake the conciliarists were making was to suppose that what we need when we have an erring pope, authority in general, what we need is some procedural block. That's what the General Council stuff is all right. We activate some procedure to stop this guy, constitutional variety. Your law hasn't met the conditions, and this legal authority will put it right. But if the church is founded on truth, actually remedies shouldn't be procedural. Remedies should appeal to truth. What happens when you get bad canonical legislation is it generally reflects bad official theology, a bad official theology of Judaism, for example. Or it might be a bad, if there is such a thing, a bad official theology of the liturgy invented in the 20th century or something like that. Who knows? This is just, and what you do clear magisterial teaching, preferably infallible, but at any rate, some clear magisterial teaching, I'm going to treat this as official theology, which has no canonical authority over me, and I'm going to challenge it through theological argument. That's the way to do it. Now, you might not convince the reigning pope of the persuasion. What you're going to be addressing is the next generation of clergy, from whom future pontiffs and bishops are going to be recruited. And that seems to me something that the church has got to leave open. It's got to be right if canonical legislation isn't infallible, and I think there's no reason to suppose it is, considerable reason to suppose it isn't. If it's not infallible, it needs to be publicly criticisable through criticism of the official theology in which it rests. That means we must mark very clearly the distinction between magisterial teaching and official theology. And one of the most unpleasant features of church history, I would particularly say of the situation of the contemporary church, is of ecclesiastical authorities who ran home coercively defective or arguable official theologies as if they were magisterial teaching. So the tradies can't have their mass because they dare to argue that their mass is better. Well, the progressives in the 50s argued their mass was better. What source of Greece is source of Gander? There doesn't seem to be any compelling magisterial teaching in either direction. You can't punish people for putting forward a theological point of view. And you can't just say, look, we've got a law, you must obey it. Paul IV Carappa had a law for the Jews. I don't think we morally had to obey that at the time. So I think the solution to this is to see that papal primacy actually has to be understood as committing to the church, not to procedural remedies for error, the will of the church, but for open discussion and ascertainment of the truth. But for that to be possible, what you need is a culture of ecclesial tolerance of disagreement with official theology and a greater respect for the distinction between official theology and magisterial teaching that you generally get in the world church. And then I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor Pink. We have an online audience as well, so I'll just have questions from the audience here. I'll ask you to use a microphone in part so the online audience can hear. And Corinne has a microphone, and I have one. Corinne, maybe if you filter to the back, and I can get the questions. We have a tradition here at the program is that we always invite our students to ask the first question. Any student questions? Undergraduates, graduate students, law students. Okay. And thank you, Corinne. Another tradition. Please stand and let us know before.
Hello, I'm Dominic Monti. I'm a PhD student in philosophy. So I agree that I have this, this situation that like the decrees against like for the canon law that you mentioned with the Jews is very bad, and like we should disobey it. More on that disobeyment, but there's also this punishment you mentioned attached to disobeying it, excommunication. So is that just a case of moral tragedy, where like whatever you do, follow the canon law, it sucks because you're doing something immoral. If you don't follow it, you get excommunicated. That sucks too.
Well, it clearly does. I mean, unjust excommunications are not unknown in the history of the church on any account, and they're fairly common. And I don't think they carry any great force in the next world, which is really what's going to be at stake. I mean, punishments, unjust punishments are unjust. What matters is they're not going to involve a moral tragedy in which it's not like a sort of supernatural version of a moral dilemma in which you're damned if you do literally and damned if you don't. But I don't think that's going to be the case with this. Yeah.
Okay, another student question.
Thank you, Professor Pink. I'm Vicky San. I'm a student here studying theology. I wrote my senior thesis on St. Robert Gallican, and from my understanding of the papacy, seems like that may distinguish a private person of the Pope and the future office of the papacy. And he tried to guarantee that there's no organization or authority in the church can negate or impute the authority of the papacy. So by your discussion on the legislation, how do we guarantee the supremacy of papacy, especially for the office?
Well, it's a legal premise. So I mean, what we're talking about is not trivialism, level of telling people what to do, like giving a wise instruction to one staff of the morning that creates trouble. We're talking about public acts of the Pope. And what Billerman's argument is that there's clearly a legal primacy. So there is no superior authority to which you. But that doesn't mean that it's morally beyond question. So if you're making a distinction between juridical structures and legal obligations that come with those juridical structures and moral obligations, which I think anyone in doing legal to give some recognition. What he's doing though is denying that when you've got a command that is really faulty, there's a legal remedy. You've just got to, well, not obey. Or you go into the other mode, which is subject to question, but only to obey. And I think the disobey and disobedience line is more hypothetical and then used to silence the considerers by saying, look, there is a solution, even if we don't have a juridically higher authority.
Okay. Additional student questions? Catalina?
Thanks so much. My name is Catalina. I'm an undergraduate here. So you touched briefly on this tension between the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass. Just wondering how you think we should view this really current conflict in light of official theology and canonical legislation.
I'm wanting to be neutral. It strikes me as very odd. I was talking to a journalist who was in this discussion with Cardinal Roach and various people in certain dicastery. And they were sort of really treating it as if it was a kind of doctrinal matter. But it's very hard to believe that as part of the original revelation, there's a revelation about what forms of liturgy are appropriate to what cultural situations. And so the progressive argument was always that whilst the right of what we call Trent was okay for Trent, it's not a modern condition. And they were all already saying that in the 40s and 50s. That doesn't seem to be a matter of revelation. What you might have had, of course, is a revelation that at all times the liturgy of the church would be appropriate to cultural conditions. But the progressives can't actually say that because they were saying in the 1950s that the then liturgy of the church was not appropriate to current conditions. So we've got a hoist on that one. So this looks like a clear case for field theology, where authoritative magisterial teaching is going to be hard. And what you've got is a lot of well, I mean, I think there's a lot of traditionalist error kind in the other direction. I don't think that the traditional liturgy is laid up in heaven as a matter of revelation either. I think what you've got is a very complex situation, changing official theology concerning the liturgy, which requires a fair degree of liberalism and provision, just because it's so difficult, and a fair tolerance of disagreement. And I don't see why that should be so hard. But that's my view.
May I follow up on that? In your solutions, you talked about open discussion and argument. Those are very intellectual solutions. What about action? Disobedience?
Well, I mean, you can disobey. It's all, I mean, supposing you don't like some legislation, it's very easy for lay people to disobey. Hardly ever are lay people subjected to canonical sanctions in this sort of field. The people that get it are the priests. They really get it. And I'm not one of those who say, well, you know, don't worry. End up as a perpetual hospital chapter. I think actually, when you get situations like this, in the long term, the only solution is through theological discussion, because everything else is going to get very problematic. So I agree. If you can get bishops on side and they don't comply, then you get the beginnings of a problem with which, say, if it's papal authority we're talking about, the Pope is going to find it rather harder to deal. And so you can get bishops on that. But then again, you need to argue, because the bishop is going to be putting himself on the line, and he needs to hear a reason why he should. Understandably. So we're back in the truth discussion. So you need to make the guess.
Hello, I'm Arjun Hassan, also an undergraduate here. In regards to the liturgy issue which we've been discussing, the Church scholar Dr. He makes the argument that but not just the Western liturgy, but all of the 6 long-standing Orthodox rites of the Church are not just a product purely of human development, but of the action of the Holy Spirit in their organic development. And so he thus eventually makes the argument, perhaps quite controversially, that what we see in the Trinity liturgy is a kind of, not peak, but at least asymptote, we could say, of liturgical development. So we see liturgical development slowing over time and the act of working of the Holy Spirit, preserving the traditional rites and prayers. So with this in mind, maybe not saying that liturgy is direct revelation, but that it is still guided by the Holy Spirit in the same way you might say the magisterium is guided, or that the development of doctrine is guided. Well, what implications does that have?
Well, I know Peter and I have a lot of respect, but I'm much more cautious than he is about making extraordinary claims for the assistance of the Spirit. The history of this that I've been discussing shows you how difficult it is to invoke the Holy Spirit for established features of the Church. It may, I mean, my view is that I take a certain sort of cultural relevance to these matters. And I also tend to think that church reforms would be all right under certain conditions, might not be all right if they're introduced by sudden change at a time of cultural change in wide cases. And that may well have been the main problem with the 1970 reform. But that's just my view. But I think, again, I don't want to take sides in the liturgy case. Actually, an issue of official theology goes far wider than the liturgy. It's a pervasive issue in the Church. We can't get rid of official theology. It's part of the way the Church functions. But it doesn't have the guarantees of theology teaching. It does change. It is actually influenced by changing arguments, great changes. And I think that if someone does want to make claims for in the formation of the liturgy, a bit more than just claims of antiquity is going to be required. After all, the legislation concerning the Jews goes back to Toledo. That's before the Arab invasions, which is Spain. So, you know, be careful. I mean, a lot of liturgy is.
Professor, thank you for your splendid lecture. It was really thought-provoking. I just wanted to make a statement and then ask a question related perhaps to both. I think it's important that you point out tolerance for disagreement, and it seems that our whole culture is no longer used to it. Catholicism has probably not cultivated it also over the last 150 years, but there is a long-standing tradition about that. I was thinking of canonical legislation that has just silently been ignored. For example, the imposition of the cloister on certain religious orders, and Mother Abbess says that's not now a tradition. We just wait for the next pope. So I think that's certainly, a tradition to be retrieved possibly. But I want to ask you about something related to Revelation, since you pointed to that in the last part, and theologians and church leaders invoking the Holy Spirit. One of the dangers I see right now is very often the equation of signs of times as a separate source of revelation. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Oh, yes. Well, this seems to be part of the official theology of Flanders, which I was referring to. Yeah. By the way, the early point Gregory XIII's Sancta Martyr Ecclesia is just not, because although it's enforced in the Papal States in certain other parts of Italy, Catholic rulers and prelates in other parts of of the world was going, what? You know, marshalling Jews in my nice city, the Holy Roman Empire, to some church every Sabbath and having them harangued at by some cleric. I'm not following that one. I'm going to borrow some money. Just didn't. So this Sancta Mater Ecclesiae is a right good letter, but it meets Bellarmine's conditions. Bellarmine's conditions don't bring in whether actually people are obeying, it's whether they've been issued rules. But obviously, you just stop obeying. As for the signs of the times, yeah, I think this is crap. But let me say a little more where I see the church is in this huge crisis, where we are not handling modernity very well. That's the least. And various people are waving flags that resist and get back. Various people are waving the flags of the signs of the times and go forward. My own view is that one gets a much better hold on these issues if one is very, very conservative, careful about magisterial teaching, and restrictive about what counts as magisterial teaching, and very liberal about official theology, and very open to a question of legislation. But that is not a common view, I think, in the church. I think it might be better if it were. And so I would resist the signs of the times on magisterial teaching. But there's a certain level on which I suppose the signs of the times, if it involved what was clearly a healthy consciousness that some laws are very unjust, perhaps wasn't so widely present in the church, and might not be so dangerous. So I give a nuanced agreement.
Please, sir.
Hi, Professor Ping. My name's Adam. So you began your discussion with like, the church as not just like a teacher, as like a persuader, but as a force of authority, which has always been the constitution of the church. Unfortunately, this is not a particularly common perception of the church today, and especially in the more mainstream, you could say, Catholicism, the idea of the church issuing a temporal sanction of punishing for heresy, for example, is simply not there. So my question of this is, do you ever see the restoration of the church as a course of focus towards something that's possible or that we should even work for? Or are we going to continue in this sort of kind of schizophrenic of sorts, say, where we say, like, yes, in principle, the church has this coercive authority to punish temporally, but in practice, we're just not going to defend it because it makes us feel easy, or just don't feel like punishing Protestants.
That's like some hard. I have achieved notoriousness, whatever, for being. I think I started off giving the interpretation of Dignitas Humanae that all integrists tend to rely on. And so a lot of people, I get hate mail about it, Catholic academics, think I'm some sort of coercion agent. And I really, if you look at Immortale Dei and Pastor Eternus, what these documents are magisterially teaching juridical structure. Pastor Eternus is about the internal juridical structure of the church. Immortale Dei is about the juridical structure of church, state, and relations. But as I've been saying throughout this talk, legal obligation, which may be established on a magisterial and legal authority, which may be established on a magisterial basis, doesn't guarantee the morality of its application. And that means I'm not committed in any way to defend what church state, which is where the conversion really came from, because you had state resources to do it. I'm not trying to defend the morality of that. A lot of people nasty and damaging to the mission of the church. There are also a wider point. How does coercion work? It's not just the coordinator model looks at it, and Hobbes does this, because Hobbes is actually on the coordination model, as if it's just you do the crime, you do the time. So you and then some obviously problematic sanction, which lead That just deters you from, whatever. But what, of course, the church has been involved in the past is the coercion of belief. And as Hobbes pointed out vividly in Leviathan, you can't enforce the rules of belief just by threatening to wax someone with something, because they don't form the belief you require them to have. Believe the Battle of Hastings took place in 1065, or I'm going to take your money away. I mean, you can't believe the Battle of Hastings took place in 1065, at least I don't, because the evidence is overwhelmingly in another direction. So how is the coercion belief going to work? Well, basically, the coercive authority has got to be a kind of epistemic authority. And it say-so must carry epistemic weight as a kind of witness. And what the threats of sanctions are doing, asserting the importance of the witness, particularly the importance of the witness to the good of the community that authority is serving. And it's only going to work with you if you do understand the convincing witness, particularly in the connection with starting to impose sanctions and if you describe. That requires quite special social conditions. It requires a great deal more respect for ecclesiastical authority than current in our culture. You could get it to work in the 17th century, where you'd have a huge amount of epistemic authority enjoyed both by the church, but especially by the Habsburg dynasty, which was a system church. It's very, very important how the Habsburgs managed to re-Catholicize. It's through the authority of the dynasty, which was seen as having been betrayed by those Calvinist nobles that had booted the Habsburg dynasty for their electoral palatine. That world is not ours. So I don't think it's possible for the church to go around in her current condition, threatening people with sanctions if they don't have certain beliefs. Maybe those special contexts will work, but it won't work. The church has to argue her standing as a witness. And one of the very, very shocking features of current is that she is, to a large proportion of the world, a far less witness than she was 50 to 100 years ago. And that's the problem that needs to be.
I have to confess, we did advertise this talk as come see a real live in.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Amanda. I'm a visiting PhD student from the University of Toronto. My question is, are there prudential reasons why disobedience might be something to avoid generally, simply because people tend to, if they want to disobey, it's very subconsciously, it's very easy to shore up arguments on their side, and therefore simply when perhaps it's better to obey, even if people kind of argue as you suggested, just because I can see this kind of rapidly escalating unless one sticks to the, for example, the example you gave with Jews, very extreme.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a familiar taught with authority functions that serve a valuable function, but they need to be respected as authority function, as authorities, otherwise they can no longer perform their function. So there must be a default presumption in favour of defence. My criticism, Bellarmine clearly is some. My criticism of this is just taking it to radical enthusiasm, which blocks all discussion. And that's been very common in the history of the church. And it's very often connected with the idea that authority, so much the infallibility of the ecclesial authority as a teacher, but the indefectibility of the church. So the church cannot fail. So God will preserve from her authority structure is going to go wrong. You see better of that. And that thought is clearly very, very common. The problem with that is that what is indefectibility guaranteed? It didn't stop the Reformation, it didn't stop the loss of the East, the Middle Ages. It hasn't stopped the crisis since the Second Vatican Council, which is de-Christianizing large parts of Western Europe. So fine, it's indefectible till she fails. The other problem is that it's a tacit assumption of a clericalist view of what indefectibility involves. Okay, God will preserve the church from failure, but the model, rather, that the application appeal to indefectibility as I've been describing, tends to assume that God will save the church through her legal authority. But that may be true a lot of the time, that maybe God will permit, in certain cases, the legal authority to go very badly wrong, and then God will save the church through disobedience and resistance to the ecclesiastical authority, or non-compliance, as I think actually quite the legislation saying it is, as I was agreeing with Ulrich. So, yeah, I mean, obviously default presumption, but sort of starry-eyed faith that whatever happens, the best thing you can do is always obey ecclesiastical authority because it'll be all right. I just don't see that that's obviously true.
I think we have time for one more question. If there's one more.
I'll just use my national microphone.
No, we need a microphone.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess my question is,
Please introduce yourself.
oh, I'm Leo. I'm a law school student. So in drawing the distinction, which I agree is very important, between the magisterial authority and sort of the changing, more determined teachings on official theology, do you find yourself concerned sometimes that we're opening up that room for debate on the official teaching at the moment? You almost, when an actual magisterial teaching comes along, it will almost lose its weight. I guess when I think I'm okay about having an ongoing debate about like the Novus Ordo versus the Tridentine and the various papal encyclicals. But then I guess once let's say the church issues a teaching on abortion or marriage, something which seems much more morally weighty, and then suddenly you have a bunch of people arguing that teaching on the truth of marriage is something which is determinatio of official theology, and suddenly it almost loses the weight, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a very legitimate worry. I mean, so of course, immediately I might say, well, look, but there is this distinction between magisterial and official, magisterial teaching and official theology, and it's marked canonically, and there are certain forms of track it. It's not impossible to tell when you pick one from the other. And you can argue this is plausibly part of the content of the preservation or not. So it's not an impossible distinction to make, but you're quite right. I think there is a tendency, and this explains why I think a lot of official theology has been rammed down people's throats quite coercively. You will be sacked if you get your theological job if you don't rely on this one. I think a lot of that has been you don't want too many people questioning the church. But the danger of this is that you will get them in the end in a more intractable form, because if you don't let official theology appear as clearly that, you will then get people pointing out, certain sort of liberal Catholic loves to do, the church always changes her teaching. And made lots of claims to how the church once taught this, and how she teaches that, like Limbo, etc., which look worrying and very plausible until you realize actually they're looking at official theology. And if you haven't made the distinction between magisterial teaching and theology, you can't make that reply. And the books exist, loads of them.
That was great. Let me remind you, we have an event this Wednesday on COVID emergency power and visibility. That's the law school at 12:30. And then on Friday, please join us for Senator Scott. Before we talk about those events, we should thank our speaker.
Were you able to catch the sound anyway? Yeah, we had a few different sources going on.
I speak. I'm incredibly sorry.
No, I think
I speak quite loudly. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just in the future, I'll be stop listening. Sorry.
Yeah,
Sure. I mean, I have been streaming. I'm